Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this webinar where Phil Wyman and I will be looking at the CAT4 Combination report. My name is Sue Thompson and I'm one of the publishing team here, and I'm responsible for CAT4. And as you'll be finding out, this is a relatively new report that we developed to include some of the new tests and assessments that we published in 2015. So I'm going to hand over to Phil now, and then I'll be coming back to you a little later in the webinar. Thank you, Phil.
Right, okay, thanks very much then, Sue. What I want to do is just take you through initially an idea that we've been developing here at GL Assessment before we have a look in more detail at the combination report. And that's something which we're calling the Whole-Pupil View for students and pupils. This is something that we've developed as a philosophy that helps go along with your judgments, your knowledge of the student, but supplies information in areas that are very hard to do within the school environment. Particularly look at the correlation between scores that you're getting on tests with a national picture. And we use standardised assessments and the trialling of assessments across the UK to be able to give you this measure of a bigger picture in reference to a whole countrywide distribution. But it's only part of looking at the progress and understanding individual students. This little diagram we have on the screen on the left really is an effort to try and capture that. For us, it's vital that the student is at the centre of all of this. Yes, we can provide extra data, we can provide that bigger picture, but that sits still within a much wider range of assessments that's going on every day in school, whether they're much lower key, as it were, perhaps in answering questions in the classroom, or that very important part, marking pupils' books and marking pupils' work. Or there very well may be assessments that you've developed yourself within school. It's very much part of a whole process, and we see it's a partnership to do that. The CDS that it talks about on the screen is what we're calling a complete digital solution. And this is a package of assessments that together help us build that, paint that picture, as it were, of a whole pupil. And you can see on the screen off to the right-hand side, they fall within basic groups. The ones that have a blue dot on the side fit within that attainment part. This is very much about where people are, reference to curriculum. And we have also a section on ability, and this is supported by our flagship assessment, the Cognitive Abilities Test. New group reading test and single word spelling test have some aspects of both. They can be used to look at year-on-year tracking, but they're also very useful for looking at the efficacy of particular interventions that might be required. And then lastly, there are a number of assessments that used together can help us build an idea of what may be holding a student back. In the forthcoming slides, I'm concentrating more looking at attainment assessments alongside the cognitive abilities test, that test of ability. So we'll be often pairing together particular attainment tests, and in one instance, not shown on the screen there, we'll also be looking at the new group reading test in its aspect of being a year-on-year tracker alongside cognitive abilities test. The cognitive abilities test is very much for us the anchor point. This is telling us about how a student could perform if they were on a level playing field, if those other barriers or other influences weren't there. Key to actually making those kinds of comparisons from one assessment to another and from one student to another is the use of standardised scores. For all of those assessments I showed you earlier, the standardised age score is one amongst many outputs in terms of data, but is the one that is very useful for making those comparisons. I've talked a little bit about how those comparisons together really improve our understanding. yes, it's vital to know where a student is in terms of their curriculum knowledge. Of what could be. You know, it's not only aspirational in terms of the students themselves, for them to know what they're more capable of achieving, but also sometimes that capability is even hidden from the teacher. And now we're moving towards those combination reports that actually put alongside those scores in ability and attainment, and more than put alongside, actually start to give us an insight as to what's going on. We've actually produced a whole suite of these new combination reports that put these two measures together. I'm now going to just have a look at a few of the reports that come out of the comparison reports and just really talk you through the kind of data that comes out. First off, if we go right at top level into the group cohort level, we can see an analysis of group scores against national average. Just to remind you one more time, this is one of the powers of this kind of national standardized assessment. It is able to give you comparisons against a national sample. Here we can see the CAT4 verbal mean scores against the progress test English mean standardized stage scores, the CAT4 quantitative mean standardized stage score against the progress test maths mean standardized stage score. And on top of that, the other areas of CAT in terms of their mean standardized age score. Obviously, it's very important to have this information about how the whole cohort performs, but we're also able to drill down further and look at how that performance is across the whole distribution of scores rather than just taking an average. We know that taking an average in anything can often lead to really good, clear insights, but it can also smooth differences where really important differences are hidden. So in this sample report, we can see that distribution of scores. In this case, it's the CAT4 verbal against the progress test English scores, but it's broken down within those stay 9 groupings, so from very low, below average, to average, above average, and very high. The pink sort of mountain in the background is the UK standardised distribution, and you can see very clearly that, speaking for myself, I found this graph very clear in that it shows where that individual cohort is way above that or way below. You can see in this particular example it is a bit of made up data, but it is very useful to see that in terms of the higher average, this particular cohort are way above the kind of national expectation, and the tail, as it were, down towards very low, is higher in the progress test English, and there doesn't appear to be anybody in the verbal part of CAT scoring in that. So it's a very clear visual reference. If you're more interested in the kind of tabular results, this is the similar information in those standardized age score bands or stay 9s, very low, below average, and so on. And for each of those in the standard distribution, we're able to see what percentage of students would fall in those groups. So in a national average distribution, we'd have 4%, for instance, in the very low, and in the very high, because as you saw earlier, that distribution is symmetrical. And in the average, if I just add up those 3 stay 9 groups that are within the average, comes to 54% of the population. And then for the actual group, the actual cohort or school here, you can see how that differs. It's basically the same kind of information, but in tabular form. Just to make clear what correlations we're actually looking at in these combination reports, we're looking at the progress test English standardized age scores against the CAT4 verbal. That's where we found the best correlation to get the most information for you. Similarly, for maths, perhaps not unexpectedly, we've got the quantitative CAT4 standardized age scores shown alongside the progress test maths. And for the new group reading test scores, again, it's verbal, perhaps not too unexpected there. Just as a kind of an aside, really for us, the kind of holy grail of this is when we'll be able to put all aspects together. We'll be able to look at attainment and ability and the barriers to learning. So as part of that progression, the next thing that we're looking at, and I don't think it's too far away,
later this year, Phil,
is pupil attitude to self and school alongside the CAT scores there.
And I can add there as well, many of our customers are now using the progress test in science. Oh, yes. And again, we are planning to incorporate that into the combination report. But because all of this analysis is based on live data, we need to build up a bank of students where we have the CAT4 data and the science attainment data as well. But that's in planning at the moment for later this year or early next year.
Excellent. Okay, just talking through some of the last few reports before I'm going to turn to Sue to actually look at some mini case studies, which I think really bring this to life. I think this is probably the last of the more generalised reports. This would normally be populated with the students' names and their individual scores. So all the students would be listed here under student name. Why I've not put that data in at the moment is it's just confusing the issue. What I'd like to just look at are the headings, really. I'm not going to talk about which ones are paired together. We've just done that. But I do want to just have a quick look at where it says discrepancy category. The discrepancy category is simply where we look at the CAT score first, whether that's in verbal or quantitative as appropriate, and then we compare it to, as we say, the score in the PTE, post-test English, post-test maths, and the new book reading test, and look at the difference. That's what we're terming the discrepancy. So it's always from CAT. It's more of a kind of expectation, as it were, from the CAT, and then we look at what's happening in terms of these other assessments, and then we try and not only point out those differences, but try and give you information that will help you explore what's actually going on. And I think that's where these mini case studies are really going to help out.
And also, just to add that all of this analysis is, again, based on real data, where we have two sets of scores for really large numbers of students. So when we say it's expected, we're basing that on thousands of cases.
Yes, and it's not as if it were prescriptive. That expectation really is the starting point for the individualisation. Then that model really comes to life, because who knows about the students on a day-to-day level? Who knows the students themselves, their motivations, their attendance, everything else that makes them an individual? Oh, so okay, that's not quite the last one. I'm getting ahead of myself. But for each of those comparison groups, so for the maths against, I'm not going to keep repeating that, maths against the quantitative though in this particular case, and similar ones can be produced for the English and the new book reading. It's just a visual representation here of where students are in terms of that discrepancy, if you like, where students are outperforming that average expectation. I'm saying average, but built on vast numbers of students, where people are performing higher than might be expected from that average, or where they're performing less well or lower than that expectation. It's just displayed visually. The pink dots are girls. I'm not very PC here, I'm afraid, but the pink dots are girls and the blue dots are boys, and people falling within the white diagonal area there would be those that it's pretty much as expectation. I did mention that we provide alongside that areas where we are not saying, oh, this is the answer to that expectation, but there's some high-level pieces of information and pointers, if you like, that might start that conversation between you and the students, or reinforce things that you know are already going on. But these are just areas where we can talk with students and we can talk with fellow professionals and we can get an idea of perhaps possible explanations for this difference. And we also group the students themselves, their names, with the appropriate question areas, if you like. So the one shown on screen at the moment is where students are having a much lower or lower than expected maths attainment, and you can see at the top of the screen some of those higher level pointers, and then you can see the students' names at the bottom. In fact, I think we've blown this up slightly larger.
Yeah, it's quite tricky to read there, isn't it?
I think so. So what we've done is divide that in and blow it up. And it's quite interesting here, I would suggest, that it reinforces that wider picture, because the very first thing on here isn't about the attainment, as it were, in day-to-day, or about ability. It's those other things that are really having a thing. You know, are they in school? It's all very well as to say, oh, we have a vast database and we can produce meaningful averages. And that's very true. But if that individual isn't going to school, they're not going to be achieving that level.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so those sort of things feed into this greatly.
I think the second point there is a really good one as well, because we're very careful to give advice about when particularly the progress test in English and Maths is administered. There is flexibility, because if you want to administer in the first half of the year, you can use the level from the year below. But again, the assumption is that a certain amount of the curriculum will have been covered, so if the test is administered at the wrong time of year, then the results may well look strange.
Absolutely. It would, sometimes that might think, oh, that's rather prosaic. You know, how is it been done at the right time of year?
Well, people are busy, aren't they?
They haven't been taught the information.
Exactly, and people are busy in school, and you know, sometimes that bit of information, even though we're reinforcing it regularly, can be missed. But it can be something quite straightforward like that.
Yes, absolutely. If we just have a look at the other half of those ideas, because I think this is worth saying as well, that although we have in this example been looking at the progress test maths and the quantitative, the role that English and the use of English plays in this. Yes, there is a very good correlation in terms of eventual grades, if you like, between progress test maths and quantitative. But they are actually looking at slightly different skill sets. And the use of language within maths, perhaps in my day, as a bit of a dinosaur here, the maths was more, I don't know, 7 times 17, take away 50, you know. It was very much the maths. Now, probably quite rightly, that's much more in the form of a problem. And often that problem will take quite a bit of unpacking in terms of language use that can in itself be an additional barrier. And I think, maybe, do we have an example of that?
I think one's coming up in a couple of slides' time.
Okay, well, we'll explore that later. Yeah, so I just wanted to make that point. Okay, so really to bring this to life, what we've done is prepare a number of mini case studies, not in huge depth, but I think seeing, as Sue said, this is based around real data. We have changed names, of course, but I think over to you.
So the first two here, we're looking at two students here where their attainment in maths is much lower than expected. And just to give a little bit of background here, Danielle has a non-verbal reasoning score of 112 and a spatial ability score of 125. So really, her maths score should be higher. Spatial ability will support the student in certain aspects of mathematics. But when we look at her verbal reasoning, so we're not even looking at her quantitative, we know that that's high and that her maths score is much lower than we would expect. But then we look at her verbal, and that is really out of alignment with her other scores. And with it being within the average range, but still at 92, as I say, out of sync, it could be that there's an issue here around reading or comprehension. And something slightly different here with Nathan. He has got much higher than expected scores in his progress test in English, but in his maths, he's the other way round. But he has a his spatial and non-verbal reasoning scores are below average, and his spatial score is actually at 81. So again, it may be worth looking at in more detail at his maths test results to see if the aspects of maths that would be supported by his spatial ability, if they are particularly weak. So if he has a skewed profile in his maths score. So it's just showing that we can do so much here, and we can highlight a discrepancy, and we can give all that information there. We can give the information at the top level, but in fact, a teacher may well want to go back and visit that individual report around the maths. It's well worth doing that. Now, this is our EAL student, and this is a very interesting case, Jahazabi. If we just look, first of all, at her NGRT score, which is 101, if that was being viewed in isolation, we would think this is a student whose reading is absolutely average. That means she'll be able to access the curriculum and make progress in literacy and across the curriculum. But then when we look at her verbal score, it's 122, so it's well above average. And this means that in the context of CAT, her reading score is much lower than expected. So I think this is a really, really nice example of where CAT can shed light on what looks like really reasonable attainment.
Absolutely.
But a teacher would know that in fact that there could be an issue with this child's reading in the light of her CAT score.
I mean, the score of 122 in the CAT verbal is going to put you inside the top 10% of students in the UK.
Yes, and this is an EAL student. The context there would be, is this a student who's been in school from the age of 5, or has she just come into the school, or maybe just come into the country? So there's all sorts of information around that student that would feed into these numbers on the page.
And that's why it's all part
of it. But this is a very nice highlight.
Yeah.
Now we need to have a little look at Joshua. So Joshua here, we're looking here again at the new group reading test. And again, he's got a pretty reasonable score at 104. You might think, well, actually, we don't need to worry too much about him. So again, we're going to look at his verbal score, which is 130. So again, this is, what are we, top 2% probably here? So very strong verbal skills. In fact, his verbal skills are the strongest aspect in terms of his ability. And we haven't got his progress test in English here, but he has a score of 93. So again, he's within the average range, but it's towards the low end of the average range. And again, this would put him in a much lower than expected category. And again, I think this is an instance where drilling down, looking at the individual reports for progress test in English, for new group reading test, and seeing are the particular aspects within his literacy or his reading that will be holding him back. So it could be reading fluency, for example. So was his comprehension weaker in both of those tests? Was he accurate but rather slow getting through the test? Is there a speed of processing issue there? All sorts of things that might emerge, but clearly Joshua should be attaining at a higher level in both his reading and his English.
I mean, that verbal score is astounding.
It is, yes, absolutely. Right, so what comes next? This is just to show, again, this is our EAL student. Again, this is exactly the same information for CAT4, and this is just showing her progress test in English. Now, there's a further complication here that would need to be paid attention to, in that the English has the technical skills section, which is spelling, grammar and punctuation. So there may be an issue here for a student who is acquiring English, that those aspects of English may actually be significantly delayed in terms of age-appropriate skills. So again, it's a case of looking in detail at PTE. I would say here, though, with a score at 73, it's likely that across the whole of the test, the scores will be low.
Yeah, and it's going to have an impact across the curriculum.
Absolutely,
yes. 73.
Yes, and there's a chance, a very able student will become disheartened. I think that's a real danger with this particular student.
Yeah, and I think now you're probably quite familiar with the idea of where the expectation in terms of the ability score and the attainment is less than that. But what we want to do as well is we also look at where students are actually performing currently in terms of attainment above that national average expectation built around their ability score. So same sort of format, pointers, I think, towards the top, students listed below. In this particular case, it's much higher or higher than expected maths attainment again. And similarly, we've cut out those questions and made them slightly larger. In this case, again, just highlighting here that where we had before those that might be weaker in their English usage, not allowing that ability in terms of mathematics to come through into everyday performance. It may very well be that those that are particularly skilled at unpacking the language, as it were, might actually outperform their levels because they've got an advantage in that they can really understand what it is they're trying to get at over and above those.
I mean, there's a point to be made here, Phil, that when we're producing our indicators, for example, for GCSE, we tend to use the mean score because we need that verbal factor in there.
In fact, going back to what you said about the science alongside this, I think there might be a number of people think, oh, well, obviously spatial is the way, but I taught science for over 20 years, and I know that as well as all those spatial and non-verbal elements, there's a lot of verbal and there's a lot of numerical work. It may very well prove that the combination of those reports, those abilities is the best.
And even if we think about looking beyond CAT, and there's so much evidence for children's levels of language development, right from the youngest children, that strong language skills will support learning across the curriculum.
Yes.
So it's really important to think about that.
Yep, okay, the second half of those sort of pointers, that doesn't seem to be on the right part of the screen. But here it should be on the line above, which shows high academic motivation. As we said earlier, as a publishing company, we know about that bigger picture national sample. But, where people have that level of motivation, they are going to outperform because they're the ones that want to do it. They're the ones that will be putting in the extra time. And motivation should never be ignored in these matters. Dead on in this case. Something that I also want to say is sometimes it seems the very last thing that's ever mentioned. But students do well when they have good, inspiring teaching and good, inspiring teachers. Let's not forget the influence that teachers have on a child's education. I think we're just finishing off with a last case study, which I think illustrates that thing we were just saying about teachers having a real impact. I think, do you want me to do this one? Yes, please do. Okay, this is Ben Lynch. I think we chose this one. It's exactly an example of that, in that his attainment in reading is above average and his verbal ability just average. And this relationship's also reflected, not on the screen here because we haven't got that particular data, but in his PTE scores. And what we're finding here is that it is a reflection on the extra work that he's prepared to put in. As we said, these are real examples, so we know about Ben, even if it's not his real name, and the extra work that he's been prepared to put in and that effort, he's outperforming what might be expected from an average level of attainment. Yes? Anything else you'd like to add to that, or was that?
I think not about Ben, but just more generally. The combination report has to include CAT4, as Phil said, that's the anchor test. But you don't have to test every year with CAT4. The report can be generated on legacy data, so you can look back 2 or 3 years and combine your year-on-year attainment data every year. So I think we haven't covered that anywhere.
I think it's important to mention though. We don't. One thing
it would be wrong.
The data is really, really useful. Hopefully we're getting that across. But on the other hand, neither do we want to submerge the child in constant assessment.
No.
Let's do the assessment that counts.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you want to, this is just one of those, your mini case studies. I think this is Danielle rather.
So we've got a student here with verbal reasoning that's in the high average range and a very, very secure reading as measured by the new group reading test. And here we have a child who is motivated, well taught, all of the things that Phil has talked about. So it might be useful to look at his progress test in English skills, again, just to look at that first section of that particular test with the spelling, the grammar and punctuation, just to make sure that he's achieving it at an appropriate level in there, so he may need some support there.
Yeah, we're trying to get across really that the kind of things that are looked at in PTE and new group reading tests are not the same.
No, and we do know that many of our schools use both, and they use them differently and they use them at different times. What you can't do is you can't put progress test in English and new group reading test in one report, but what you can do is you can run 2 combination reports with your CAT data for your English.
These aren't at any extra cost.
No, they're free. They're free to every.
So do feel free to keep running reports.
And I think what happens is that when our customers buy CAT4, this is automatically subscribed to them, and then as they want to, they can add in one or other or all.
I just wanted to make it clear, when we say, oh, run it for NCERT, run it for, we're not trying to sell it because it's actually part of the package. So let's go back to my kind of Yorkshire roots here and say, it's free, let's make the very best use of it we can.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think that's pretty much all that I wanted to say. What about you, Sue?
I can't think of anything else. No, I think that's it. So thank you so much for listening to this afternoon.